everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Bosshole Chronicles. I am your co-host, Sarah Best. Today, I'm joined, as always, by the Brofessor, my buddy, my partner in crime, John Brower. Hey, John, how are you?
I am amazing, Sarah. Real good. And oh my gosh, what a guest subject matter expert we have today. And you know what? I don't know of two people who started a podcast 2.5 years ago, didn't know what they were doing, who have been blessed with so many amazing guests. And today is another example of that. We are going to be talking to Dr. Tasha Eurich. And I mean, Tasha is an organizational psychologist, researcher, best-selling author, most recently known for her book, Insight. Also, her first book, Bankable Leadership, and she's going to talk a little bit about some new work that she's doing. But she has worked with tens of thousands of leaders. Many of you may know her from her TED Talk around self-awareness. And by the way, go to the show notes; it'll be in there. You might recognize a couple of her clients: Google, Salesforce, the NBA, Nestle, Johnson & Johnson. I mean, it goes on and on.
The White House.
Oh yeah, the White House Leadership Development Program.
Yeah.
Quite a remarkable individual, and we are so lucky to add her to the list of guests on the Bosshole Chronicles. So what do you think, Sarah? Are you ready?
I'm ready. I think our listeners are going to be blown away by the simplicity, yet the power of her approach on self-awareness. So let's dig in.
The Bosshole Chronicles are brought to you by Real Good Ventures, a talent optimization firm helping organizations diagnose their most critical people and execution issues with world-class analytics. Make sure to check out all the resources in the show notes and be sure to follow us and share your feedback. Enjoy today's episode. Tasha, it is absolutely great to have you here on the Bosshole Chronicles. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And we couldn't think of anybody better to have us join in the conversation around self-awareness. And Tasha, for your benefit, our listeners, just with our work around talent optimization and leadership development through all of our diagnostics, self-awareness is always the centerpiece to helping people, managers, supervisors, and staying out of the boss hole zone, helping them understand themselves better. And that's really been at the core of your work. So can you take us back a little bit? I know there's been a ton of research that you've done, and we will post your TEDx talk and links to your books. Before we get to the books, just take us back to that origin about self-awareness is it. I've got to really dig into this.
Sure. It's a long time ago now, and it really kind of set the course for my career, which I didn't anticipate would happen at the time. But I've been an organizational psychologist for the last 20 plus years. And what I saw in, the early period of my career was this really consistent phenomenon that, I know you guys have a whole podcast about, right? Which is that the executives that I worked with that were willing to question the assumptions they had about themselves, to learn different ways they might be perceived, to further clarify who they were and what they stood for, were always more successful, and not just more successful, but just better off. They had higher well-being, more confidence, more happiness than the folks who were not willing to do those things. And this was probably around 2014 or so. I remember it was over the Christmas holiday, and most of my clients have all their vacation and time off during that period. So I had a little bit of free space and time. And I remember that I had read several articles that week about self-awareness, and they were be more self-aware, introspect. And I said, yes, I agree. But the one thing that I didn't know, even from my own experience and from what I was reading, was what did the science actually say? And so I started, sort of naively at first, like just reading empirical journal articles about the topic of self-awareness. And as I started to do that, I discovered that there's actually not as much out there as we would think, given how critical the skill is. And so I sort of took it upon myself as a, PhD in a really quantitative field of psychology to bring together a research team to investigate some of the questions that I wanted the answers to. What is self-awareness? Where does it come from? Why do we need it? And then probably most importantly, how do we get more of it? So our research, it's still going on. It's not something that we would ever just stop because a book came out about it, but we've looked at, thousands of people all around the world that we've quantitatively surveyed. We've read, couple thousand empirical journal articles at this point, so you don't have to. We can summarize it. And then probably for our purposes today, even the most interesting part of our research was we found 50 people, 50, very different backgrounds all around the world, who didn't start out as self-aware, but who through some process that we wanted to elucidate were able to become really dramatically, remarkably more self-aware. And we called these people our self-awareness unicorns because at first my team was worried we wouldn't find any. I knew we would because I had been coaching them, for my career. But that was actually where we had so many surprises and really some of, I think, the biggest contributions to what we know about this important skill.
Well, and if I may, one of the interesting outcomes, and I don't know as a researcher that you would consider this a happy accident, just to sort of reference Bob Ross, the painter, that you expected, the expectation was that, well, self-aware people are going to be happier, content, and actually it was the opposite, right? You started to realize higher degrees of self-awareness actually evoked or created perhaps more negative responses to a degree.
So there's a nuance there that I think is important. It wasn't that we found that self-aware people had those outcomes. Quite the contrary. I can give you a litany of positive outcomes that self-aware people experience. But what I think you're talking about is people who spent time introspecting. So this idea that, it goes all the way back to Sigmund Freud, that all we had to do is sort of lay on a couch and talk about our mother, think about why do we do the things we do? And it really, that psychological excavation activity, that was what we discovered was not just negatively associated with self-awareness, but it was negatively associated with well-being. And I was floored. I mean, as a lifelong introspector myself and really trying to do my best to understand who I am and how I'm showing up, I was very perplexed. But as we started to look at some of the research behind this, there were other studies that had shown similar things. And interestingly, it turns out that it's not that introspection in and of itself is bad or wrong. It's just that the way most people do it leads us down a path that A, makes us less self-aware, and then B, actually makes us more stressed, anxious, depressed, etc. So there's a little bit of a paradox on the face of it between, people who are self-aware are very self-accepting, they're confident, they're happy, but they've figured out sort of a different way to go about that process than, including me, what most of us think is what we're supposed to be doing when we're introspecting.
Is this a good place to also identify, so introspection versus monitoring your inner dialogue, which is something you talk about?
Yes. And we were talking about that a little bit before the show. You had a really excellent question and it made me ponder a little bit, which was, what does self-awareness for our thoughts look like?
Yes.
And, there are aspects of this, and I'm sure we'll get into it with where introspection is less helpful. Like, why did I say what I said in that meeting? Or, why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? That are much less helpful, scientifically, empirically. But what is really helpful, the research has shown, is to monitor our inner monologue. And, that includes everything from just what are the thoughts that you're thinking today? What are those conscious, accessible things? Like, I woke up this morning, I'm so burnt out. I'm so tired. That's interesting. Okay, so I'm aware of that thought. I'm going to keep an eye on that and see if I'm still feeling that way tomorrow or next week or 2 weeks from now. It could also include our inner monologue response to the world around us, right? What are the stories that we're telling about the people that we encounter or the things that happen to us? That's an area where, again, as long as we don't overanalyze it, which is, by the way, not self-awareness, as long as we don't overanalyze it, those can give us really valuable clues just about how we can live the best life possible and how we can be the most empathetic, compassionate leaders as we possibly can.
I'm grateful that you differentiated monologue from dialogue, because it's really not a dialogue. It is a monologue. And the attention to that monologue then creates insight and potentially new action. That's probably a whole nother conversation, isn't it? How do we bring that to our conscious awareness, and how do we translate that into new behaviors or new approaches?
Let me give you one simple tool that might just, this is, to your point, just scratching the surface, but I call it the best friend test. And this tool is especially helpful for anyone, just hypothetically, I'm definitely not like this, that, sort of overanalyzes or over ruminates, where we're kind of beating ourselves up for things that weren't perfect, et cetera. And it's to ask yourself, the next time that you feel kind of down on yourself, you're questioning, what was that interaction I had with my spouse, or, gosh, I really just wasn't my best self today, is to ask yourself, would I say to someone that I love and respect what I just said to myself?
Well, that's good.
That's a powerful question.
And I think it, even just the question unearths what can be less than positive thought patterns and, in that inner monologue. And, if we're paying attention to it, I think that's more than what most of us do on a daily basis, let alone say, what do I want to do about this as the next question?
Oh my gosh. And you know what just kind of clicked in my mind? We often say that no one was born to be a boss hole. That people don't come to work going, I'd like to make everyone's life miserable today and micromanage and be difficult and say no. Yeah, they don't do that. But how many people, and certainly I know you talk to leaders like we do, they are lacking self-regard. They are feeling that absence of self-respect and self-regard. Or they may not be conscious of it, but this is where that all happens. What you just described is what can pull a leader's presence and behavior and attitude and response to things away from the good, because they're stuck in a loop of beating oneself up. I think that was a really great question and a great tool that probably a lot of people don't know they need to try out. Does that make sense?
Yep, it does. It does. So, what I would say to anyone listening is give it a whirl. See, you might say, oh, well, I'm not that self-critical, but then you might find yourself, in a situation where you are getting down on yourself in a way that's not productive for you, for the people around you. I see that a lot, actually, in the executives I coach, and I work in usually the top 1 or 2 levels of mid-sized to large companies, where the person, is going to work and trying to do the best they can every day, but they're getting in their own way. And there are lots of ways we can get in our own way, which is why your podcast exists, right? But I think that we minimize the attention to the internal things that we can really be sort of holding ourselves back without even really realizing it.
Well, I want to build on this idea of the inner monologue, and you had touched upon empathy and this sort of external focus. Sometimes I think when we talk about lack of self-awareness, when we're describing a boss hole or we have this boss hole experience, we're talking about somebody who doesn't even know how they show up. So they're not aware of the tone of their voice or the look on their face or, the way in which they deliver news, that kind of stuff. How can they move to better be aware of what's happening outside of them?
And is this related to the thinking versus knowing that you frame up, Tasha?
Well, I think the thinking versus knowing is more about that introspection.
Okay. Okay.
But I think let me make a distinction that might be helpful here.
Sure.
So we discovered in our research that there are really sort of 2, I would call them camera angles of self-awareness. One is the way we see ourselves, and then self-awareness being understanding ourselves. And 2 being how other people see us, and then understanding how other people see us.
Yes.
What was really interesting, at least to me, was that A, you need both types of self-awareness to be self-aware. And B, there was almost no relationship between those 2 types of self-knowledge. There was actually, for any math nerds or stats nerds listening to this, there was a 0.0 correlation between what we called our internal and external self-awareness. And what that means really practically for any leader is we have to focus on both. So we have to work on, for example, internal self-awareness monitoring our thoughts and feelings and behaviors, on knowing our values, understanding our patterns, knowing what our reactions are to things, just as much as we have to understand what's the impact that we're having on other people, and how is it that other people are experiencing our behavior and our presence and so on. And I think, one way to look at that, if you're wanting to focus on your self-awareness, is which of these two aspects of my own, self-knowledge am I doing better at, and which might I be neglecting? And this isn't always the case. We have, because they're independent, you can be high on both, low on both, high on one, low on the other. But for most people, they kind of have a default that they go to. Like for me, as an example, I tend to default towards thinking about how other people perceive me more than, what do I actually want? Like, I'll give you, this is a silly example, but, a couple years ago, my car lease was up and I had to pick a new color for my new car. And instead of sitting down and looking at the 9 options that I was given by the dealer, I texted like 5 of my closest friends and I asked them what color they thought I should buy for my new car.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Right. Instead of saying like, yeah, what would make me really, really happy here?
Yeah.
What's the ideal color of my car?
Did you get 5 different answers? Just curious.
No, you know what? I think it was like split down the middle, and then I ended up saying, yeah, well, I agree with the majority conveniently, right?
Good. Yeah, that's a riot.
Okay. Well, don't leave us in suspense. What was the final color?
It was a nice metallic white.
Very okay. Perfect.
Yeah,
perfect.
Yeah.
Safe bet. Good bet.
Go back to the example, though. Okay, so the external was really your default in that case.
Exactly. And that's not to say that 100% of the time my default is to external self-awareness.
Right.
But this is another thing your listeners can really just start to pay attention to. What am I analyzing in my day-to-day experience? And there's a lot of people that fall on the other side of the spectrum. I call them introspectors, where, they might journal, or they might really love like self-improvement reading, or even, going to therapy. It feels really, really rewarding to them because they're excavating and, kind of understanding those inner parts of themselves. And what I would say to introspectors is, great, like that's an excellent start. And, just like I need to pay attention to my own inner experience, they can probably do well by adding in that other angle of, how do I know how other people see me? Am I really asking for feedback that much? Am I really listening to feedback when I get it? That's what allows us to all, eventually, hopefully, approach that unicorn status of, really dramatic improvements in our self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We'll be right back.
With employee disengagement at its highest level in 9 years, your company can't afford to miss the mark when it comes to optimizing your hiring, management, and team performance practices. At its lowest level, employee turnover costs you $11,000 per person. And those are dollars you can easily save with the right set of people analytics. Real Good Ventures is a talent optimization consultancy specializing in world-class analytics specific to your people and the critical role they play within your organization. Gain confidence in your hiring practices, keep the boss holes from driving your talent away, design your teams for flawless execution, and create a culture that offers meaning and fulfillment. Real Good Ventures has a family of validated diagnostic tools specific to the human aspect of business, because we know that all business issues are people issues. Visit us today at www.realgoodventures.com and bring meaning and fulfillment back into your workplace.
Okay, let's get back to the program. Well, this is a great segue or an opportunity to plug. You actually have developed a validated 70-item self-awareness assessment. But if listeners go to your insightbook.com site, they can actually take the quiz, and it requires input from someone else. So it's an opportunity to really look at both channels.
Exactly. Yeah, it actually took us almost 5 years to develop this really lengthy self-awareness assessment. It was a multi-rater assessment.
Yes.
It measured, 7 different types of self-knowledge. And as part of the release for my book about all this insight, several years ago, we said, hey, why don't we take like a 5-minute version of that? We'll take a couple items from every scale, and then we'll create kind of a computer program where you can fill it out. It takes 5 minutes for you, and then you actually can send it to someone via email who knows you well, and then they answer those, I think it's 14 questions about how they see you. And it's really cool. It spits out this report that gives you kind of a high level picture of your internal and external self-awareness. And then based on your results, usually 2 or 3 specific things that you can do to, make some improvement if that's what you decide to do. And we initially thought it would just be this like gimmicky marketing thing, to be honest, but so hundreds of thousands of people have taken it. And I get messages all the time from people just saying, I always tell people, please don't make any major life decisions based on this, because this is literally a 5-minute, like party trick version of the assessment, but it can just be a data point, right? And people say, oh my gosh, it was so helpful. Or there's some people like frequent flyers who will take it, but every time they take it, they have a different friend rate them.
Right. They're waiting for that correct external input. That's right.
Exactly. Yeah. They will keep searching until they find it, but it's totally free. And we continue to keep it out there and supporting it just to hopefully give resources to make the world a little bit more self-aware.
And just as a quick reminder to all our listeners, go to the show notes. You will see the links to Tasha's books, to insight.com, because we absolutely, just based on what it can do and what it offers, go there. You'll want to get that. Go ahead, Sarah. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say, for anybody who's, cautious or concerned or intimidated about this idea of self-awareness, and maybe they know they need to grow that capability, this is a way to dip your toe in the water with a safe person. I love that.
Because you can pick, right? You get to decide who is that other rating.
That's right.
So, Tasha, Insight was actually your second book.
Correct.
Bankable Leadership was number 1. Can you just give we'll put links to both, but tell us a little bit more about Insight. In addition to what people can get in terms of a practical tool, just a little bit more of origin of its writing and what that motivation was for putting it together.
Oh, I love that question. It really takes me back. It was interesting. When I started this research program, I sort of had it in the back of my mind that it could be a book, but I wasn't really sure. As a scientist, I thought, well, it depends on what I find. If I find a bunch of like really boring stuff, nobody's going to want to read it. But if I find some really interesting, sexy stuff, then maybe it is a book. And what was fun about that process was, as I've sort of explained already, there were a lot of twists and turns and a lot of surprises, a lot of things that really sort of fundamentally challenged the foundation of how most people see self-awareness, including me at the time. And so it became clear, maybe a year or so in that, I would be doing people a disservice if I didn't write a book about this, because, again, it really practically changes. If you know what these insights are, it practically changes what your self-awareness journey can look like. And the positive thing I think that, we kept finding was this is not like an extremely time-consuming thing. Most of our self-awareness unicorns weren't devoting hours and hours and hours a week to the practice of self-awareness. They had figured out how to hack it. And so, in the most sort of simple terms, I think one way to look at the book is to learn those self-awareness hacks. What do our self-awareness unicorns do differently from the rest of us? What have they figured out? And usually in a more efficient way, because of course they're magical self-awareness unicorns.
Right.
And, a lot of people say, I've actually decreased the amount of time I spend on my self-awareness, but I'm getting more insight. So it's kind of, it's how to be smart about your self-awareness journey.
I have a question about insight. I know, and you referred to this a little bit earlier, the 7 types of self-knowledge that separate the aware from the unaware. Of those 7, are there any that would surprise people? Like we haven't heard of them or we haven't thought of them in our regular living?
So a couple of them surprised us, to be honest, because we started with what the current empirical research kind of showed as the dimensions of self-awareness. So things that we would normally think of, things like what are our values, right? What are the principles that we want to live our lives by? What are our aspirations? What are the things we want to experience and achieve in our lives? What's the impact that we're having on other people? But as we started to develop the assessment, we had a couple of sort of new things come out. Obviously we were measuring people's knowledge of their weaknesses and their strengths and their kind of in the moment awareness. But there were two, actually one really that came out that was so obvious, I couldn't believe we didn't put it in. And that was understanding our passions. So what are those things that make us want to leap out of bed in the morning, and how can we kind of design our lives so that we're maximizing the amount of time and energy we spend on those things? And, there's obviously it's important to be self-aware and to know all these important things, but if you don't know what lights you up, how can you possibly get all the benefits from self-awareness, right? How, if you're in a job that you're not passionate about, you can sort of get to a self-awareness ceiling in a sense, because you have the knowledge to be fully actualized, but you're not acting on it yet. And so to me, I think that was almost the missing piece of the puzzle in some ways. Is self-awareness is pointless on its own, but once you have it, you can make empowered and important decisions.
I can't get over the idea that knowing your passions isn't something many of us ever spent time on, or even had conversations or overheard adults talking about when we were growing up. I don't know if that's a generational thing, but it just kind of like, wow, it is your why, of course, but it's more than your why. It's your zing, it is what motivates you to move. But I just don't think as a society, we make a lot of room for that.
I agree with you. And it's an interesting research question, actually, whether there are, generational or kind of age differences. But I do think we've made a little bit of headway in the last few years, just collectively, based only on hearing news headlines and, of phenomena where, for example, the Great Resignation.
Yes.
In some sense, that was a bunch of people saying, hey, I'm not passionate about what I'm doing, and I want to be passionate about what I'm doing. Now, granted, there's also the headlines coming out now about all the people that regretted their Great Resignation.
Right.
So I think it's a little more complicated than that. But I think, in its simplest sense, that is maybe an indication that we're changing the conversation at least a little bit.
Well, and as we say, our mission at Real Good Ventures is to help people find meaning and fulfillment in their work. And it's completely achievable as long as you have the right objective data. That people, we talk about the head, heart, and briefcase. That's a whole nother podcast. But when people can attain that, it can be done. But a lot of that has to do with at least understanding themselves and understanding what really drives them. And realizing that pursuit is noble and honorable, and it's something that you can do. I think, Tasha, you're living proof that, what you are doing right now, the work you do with your clients, your speaking engagements, how you are, putting this into writing is an example of a passion fulfilled. And unless I'm wrong, it just, it just pours out of you. Just go watch Tasha speak. It just
riveting
emanates from you. That's right.
That is the most wonderful compliment, because it's acknowledging when we find our passions and when we're able to design our lives to allow us to focus on them, amazing things happen, ideally, not just with ourselves, but in the contribution we make to the world. And so that's like the nicest compliment I could ever hear, I think.
Well, it's so evident in what you do. But I do have a very practical question, and it's a client-based question. I'm not going to use any names really quick.
No first and last names or addresses.
No first and last names. Yeah. But we nobody, as Sarah said, nobody is born a boss hole. But we have clients, obviously, senior executives, managers. They drift into the boss hole zone, and our work with them around self-awareness through their behavioral data, EQ, psychological safety. They know. There's an understanding of their wiring and what is driving sort of their needs, their behaviors, how they're showing up. And the whole point of our work is to help them adapt. We're not going to change them. Humans don't change. We say circumstances change. Humans, through self-awareness, know how to adapt, and they learn that. But what about a few of our potential boss holes that are listening out there that have all this awareness, but they're not adapting? It's like you want to go to shake them by the shoulders and say, we've already talked about this. You already know that you keep showing up this way, yet you understand that it's not getting the kind of results you want. I'm not even sure that question makes sense, but they're not able to make that step.
Yeah. Is the question kind of what would, and I
what's wrong with
you
them?
Guys to share.
No,
that's not the question.
No, I'm kidding.
The question is what to do, right?
What advice would you give that leader who just has that? What? Go ahead.
Well, this is a chapter in your book, or it's a reference in your book, how to deal with the delusional people in your life.
Right.
Okay.
Good. Let's go there.
So there's a couple ways to look at this. And I love the lens you both kind of gave is, one is, how can I stop getting in my own way?
Mm-hmm.
And then another way to look at it is, how do I help other people stop getting in their own way? So maybe those are two little rabbit holes that we can get into.
Wowza.
But I think, John, to your question, there is a space between awareness and action that if we're not fully committed, if we don't have the full support, if we don't have the right tools, we can miss opportunities. And that's really the way I look at that is when but you're not sort of deciding what you want to do about it, then you're missing that opportunity for being more effective, for being more confident, for being more successful.
Yeah. And
so the question then becomes, I think, how do you give yourself a better shot? What I see quite often, and this usually isn't in my clients because I simply don't let them do this, but what I see is people trying to take on too many things at the same time. So if I, let's say I take the insight quiz on Tasha's website and I learned that, my internal self-awareness is lacking. So I say, okay, what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start journaling. I'm going to find a therapist. I'm going to go on long nature walks, and I'm going to go to a meditation retreat. And then, surprise, what happens? So maybe I do those things. Maybe I do them for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but then life gets in the way and those things fall off my priority list. Oftentimes, when people take on too much, the boomerang effect can be more demotivating than as if they had never even done those things. Wow. Right.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so what I think I would say to anybody who's listening and wants to feel like they're making more progress on that journey is make it easier for yourself. I know that everyone listening to this is motivated and successful and focused. And, sometimes those things can work against us in a situation like this. So it's not a crime to make things easier for yourself. It's, in fact, if you do what I do with my executive coaching clients, you're focusing on one thing, one thing at a time. And hopefully it's one thing that's going to make a big difference, but it's also one thing.
Yeah.
So maybe it's, and make it an easy goal. If I pick journaling, because I want to be more in tune with kind of my inner world and experience, don't write every day, for goodness sake. Say, I'm going to write, every time something happens that I want to better understand. So then you're not locking yourself into something. Obviously, you want to check in and say, well, it's been 3 months since I've written in my journal. That's not good.
Right.
But to sort of take away the the pressure or the weight that you might feel from doing it, to making it something that's actually valuable and doable.
If our listeners can just tune in to the very practical insight, powerful insight you just shared, that's how you write. Like how you speak about this in plain English, and it's so digestible. Yes, I could see myself doing that. I want our listeners to know that's how you speak. That's how you write. They need to grab onto these ideas. They need to get your book. They need to listen and tune in, because it's not that hard. I mean, it really is doable. You make it so possible.
Yeah, I have a friend who jokes about my job all the time, and he says, it is really not rocket science what you do.
Man. Wow.
It belies the 20 years of experience and the PhD, of course, but in a sense, he is right. I think our jobs are to help simplify this process for people. And there's something really powerful about that, is to say, oh man, this doesn't have to feel so terrible for me to work on my self-awareness. This is actually engaging or fun. That's always the goal, I think.
Tasha, and really quick, because I know we're gonna wrap up here in a second, but when I think about your focus on self-awareness, and so many of the episodes we've had yet in the last couple of months around emotional engagement, noble purpose, vulnerability-based trust,
belonging,
peace building, compassionate leadership. This is not your leadership or management development of the last century. This has to be the way we evolve our leaders and our managers. And it's been there. And the good ones, the unicorns, have always understood that secret. We just have to make it more broadly known and get people, fold them into this wonderful world of developing people that doesn't have to be abusive or full of boss holes.
Oh, amen. I feel so strongly about what you just said that about 2.5 years ago, I started a global pay it forward project that I call the Tasha 10. And it's like 16 or 17 people, but these incredible practitioners and thought leaders in the area of human-centered leadership, which I think is just a wonderful summary of all the concepts that you just mentioned. There's so much to it. But they're doing great work all around the world in every industry you can think of. And, my job is to kind of teach them everything I know for free and bring them together and give them support, because it has to be a movement, to your point, right? Like it's not natural for us to focus on these things. Certainly we haven't been taught them particularly well. And then it's also, a lot of it goes against, our sort of natural way of being, which is crazy to think about, but humans are busy and they're goal focused, and they, sometimes they have tunnel vision. But that's the only way I think we're going to be able to get there is for there to be, lots of movements like what you guys have, like our Tasha 10 community, to show people just the value, the importance. It's not nice to have. It's not, let's try to be more empathetic if we have the time and the energy. It's, right. This is central, not just to our roles and as in our jobs, but as human beings on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and would you agree, Tasha? It's the responsibility. It's the added responsibility. If you're responsible for developing other people, if you're a leader, you own the need to develop this self-awareness and be effective and develop and grow your effectiveness. Agree.
Absolutely. It's a responsibility. It's a great responsibility to be a leader. And that's one example for sure.
I love it's something you said about your book Insight, but I think it speaks to just the work you do in general. And I think it's an encouragement that our listeners should hear. 3 simple facts that self-awareness is the exquisite foundation to a life well lived. I mean, you just kind of want to settle into that it is possible to make the journey. It is possible. You make it very possible. And I think we have great tools we can use, and that the courage and effort it takes to get there are well worth it. Not just because we have to or we should, but because we can. And we benefit, and the people we care about benefit.
Oh, I love what you just said. That's so well stated.
Well, you said it, actually. I just said it.
No, but what you added on at the end, because we can. Because we can.
Yeah.
So Tasha, first of all, thank you so much on behalf of all of our listeners out there in the Bosshole Transformation Nation. Thank you for being with us, and let us know what's on the horizon for you. What's next?
So I've been working on a new book for almost 3 years now, and we finally sold it at the end of last year. And so it's also based on some really surprising research around the area of resilience and how can we build a beautiful life in a world of constant change and chaos.
Because that's the way the world is, for sure.
Exactly. It's not changing anytime soon. And I finally had to accept that.
Yeah.
But a lot of really new, very interesting things, not unlike the Insight research process, actually. So stay tuned.
That'd be great. And if you are so inclined, when it publishes, we'd love to have you back.
Oh, man, let's do it.
Tasha, this has been great. So good having you here. And we hope to have you. I don't want to hang
up yet. I like talking to you.
I know, that was so fun. That time flew by.
And just all the best to you. Absolutely.
Thank you both. Really nice to meet you. Such a great discussion. Thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Good luck.
See you soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
And we'll see you next time on the Bosshole Chronicles. We'd like to thank our guest today on the Bosshole Chronicles. And if you have a Bosshole Chronicles story of your own, please email us at mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. Once again, mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. thebosshole chronicles.com. We'll see you again soon.